We're going to hit record. This is the sound of inklings, guys. Can you hear the people inkling the ivories all around us? Hi, welcome to Beer Christianity. I'm Jonty.
I'm Drabs.
I am Laura.
And we are in the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford because a smart listener said to us, hey, you're in Oxfordshire, why the hell aren't you recording in the Lewis Tolkien pub? And we're like,
absolutely a legit comment.
Beer is cheaper than Broadway's. So
it is.
That listener.
Very similar vibe, very Donish and Broadway's as well, I think is the vibe. Drabs, you've never been here before. Can you describe for our listeners, particularly not in England or Oxfordshire, or indeed did come, what it's like?
Yeah, so I think this is the stereotype of what you imagine an English pub to be like, and whoever wrote nook into the Oxford Dictionary was thinking about this particular spot right here. This is a nook or a cranny, I'm not really sure.
It's either a crook or a nanny. It's very...
I have always imagined a cranny to be smaller than this.
this is more nook than cranny.
More of a nook than a cranny, I would imagine.
It's solidly in the nook zone.
Yeah, on the nook to cranny spectrum, I think we're leaning towards nook rather than cranny.
I feel uncomfortable. So it's all like, dark wood paneling.
Mahogany, one would presume.
Yeah, or pine painted dark brown. It looks a lot more like. And there are, like nice kind of billiards green walls and paintings of C.S. Lewis. I feel like there's a painting of C.S. Lewis above us, and gold filigreed fitting lamps that look like they were polished or cleaned the last time when Lewis and Tolkien were here, and a shelf full of single malts, which are. Do any of those look good to you, Drabs?
Most of them, actually. I'm not too fussy. So.
And then there's a kind of a cranny / nook just across the hallway where there's another painting of Lewis smoking a pipe with a kind of psychedelic pink background, looking like he's smoking opium or something, rather than.
A very knowing look on his face.
He does.
He knows something that we don't know.
He does. He knows the eschatology of the Narnia books and whether they're pre-millennial. What are you asking me for? This is as a kind of like warm-up chat for the sound check. Drabs is like, what was the question you asked?
Well, Laura's just commenting on reading a quote from the final battle, and I asked if his eschatology was pre-millennialist or what. Laura's response was unsatisfying.
As if you've listened to this podcast before, you will know that my response was obviously, Drabs, you must speak in smaller words to me because but I don't know big words. I'm not.
I don't even know if Lewis said, so we showed up here and we asked what the best beer was and they lied about that. And then and we asked what we needed to know about Lewis and Tolkien. And what was the response?
She said, she was lovely, and she said that this is where Tolkien and Lewis used to come and get drunk and read their books to each other. And this is the first place that the first chapter of Lord of the Rings was read.
There we go.
I don't like Lord of the Rings, so is that okay? Do you like Lord of the Rings, Laura? I feel like you would.
I have never managed to get through a Tolkien book. I have tried to get through The Hobbit on multiple occasions and have never succeeded.
Do you keep coming back to it? Would you describe it as Hobbit for me?
Jonty is so funny. All you listeners, I know, are jealous that we have Jonty as a friend and that you do not.
You're missing out.
Yeah. I've never managed to get through it, which I feel like it's a bit. No, do we have the right to drink in this pub if we've never managed to?
I have the right to do whatever the hell I want because I'm a Protestant.
I do love the films, Viggo Mortensen is my guy.
So this is the pub where it all began for Viggo Mortensen, and I think that's the important thing. Maybe we should go around and ask people who are drinking here for the experience how much of a fan they are of Viggo Mortensen.
I mean, he is the real hero here. I think he's the real figure that we need to remember from this experience. Viggo Mortensen. I used to have my phone background used to be Viggo Mortensen, but just like a really like zoomed in, cropped in picture of his face, just being weird. It was great.
This is good radio, people. I think that's what we can all agree.
You did a literary episode a little while back with some absolute hero from the Grand Green Festival whose name is
David Jasper.
And you asked a very profound question about, along the lines of why do Protestants suck at art compared to Catholics? I just think that's because when we're talking about Lewis and Tolkien, my knowledge isn't fantastic, but my understanding is their interpretation of their literature was very much a reflection of the kind of distinct Protestant and Catholic kind of faith, and Tolkien, being a Catholic, believed more in the subtlety and the mystery and the myth and meaning coming through that, whereas Lewis, being a Protestant, wanted a more kind of in-your-face, hard-hitting, systematic kind of approach.
Didactic. We are going to have a lion in it, and it's going to be God.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally sing the earth into formation in the beginning.
Legit?
In The Magician's Nephew, he sings Narnia into formation. That is actually something that happens.
And is it, in fact, as Protestants are reluctant to embrace mystery, that makes us worse at art?
I think it is exactly why we are worse at art. Although, do you know Makoto Fujimura?
I do not.
Makoto Fujimura is a Japanese-American artist who does kind of abstract expressionism, but is influenced by kind of traditional Japanese art as well, and does a lot of calligraphy with it. And there was a big Zondervan Bible. I know, Zondervan putting out a Bible. Who knew?
Zondervan, owned by Rupert Murdoch, by the way.
No. Oh, wait,
sorry,
you told me this.
Sorry,
before.
friends.
Oh, that's it. So we're burning our Bible, and he does these amazingly beautiful paintings, which are very rarely literal. They're not depictions of something. They're more abstract. He just I interviewed him once, and he talked about mystery and about not having to kind of be nervous about things that were numinous and kind of I don't want to say vague, but just hard to define in a kind of didactic C.S. Lewis kind of way. And he's a Protestant. And I think there are a number of Protestants who are kind of more comfortable with that. But, definitely the great art has been made by the Catholics. But then, Tolkien is the exception, I think, to that. I think that's the important thing. I already assumed one of you guys would dig Tolkien.
I mean, I think I will say that with... we're talking being a Catholic and probably being slightly less overt in his plugs for Christianity in Lord of the Rings. He is less likely to have become problematic in the future, because I feel like C.S. Lewis has definitely fallen down that hole. And if any of you haven't read The Last Battle, then I feel like I'm going to ruin your childhoods by telling you that Susan does not get to go to heaven.
I feel like you hopped on this before. You're a big fan of Susan. Is it because she's a bitch?
No. Wow. So Jonty implying that I'm not going to get to heaven because I'm the bitch that sides with Susan. No, I skim reread The Last Battle for our dear listeners out there to bring you some childhood destroying quotes, such as "My sister Susan," answered Peter shortly and gravely, "is no longer a friend of Narnia." And would you like to know why Susan is not a friend of Narnia? She's interested in nothing nowadays except nylons and lipstick and invitations. She was always a jolly sight too keen on being grown up. Yes, you heard it here first. Susan does not get to go to heaven because she likes lipstick and nylons.
I mean, I think that's a quite narrow reading of that passage. It has to be said, Nora. That's like, I think it's the grown-up thing that it made. I mean, I've never read Narnia either. Have you guys read Narnia?
Yeah. No, but I have worn lipstick. And I'm quite worried now about the eternal conscious torment that I would be subjected to.
Yeah, I just feel like Susan just gets a bad lot in that, like, literally basically every other character in the Narnia books gets to go to heaven apart from Susan.
But that sounds like it's kind of in keeping with C.S. Lewis's general vibe that you do get to choose, right? That's the thing. Like you do get to choose whether you go to heaven or not. Is that the vibe?
Mostly choice by intellect, I think, is a lot of the vibe as well.
Have you guys? I haven't read our podcast's namesake, Mere Christianity, because
I've read that.
So, like, have you guys?
Yeah.
It's been a while, but it was super, super influential on me. I think it's a classic, kind of like contemporary evangelicals will understand it entirely. I think it's been hugely influential on the kind of like general evangelical church. It just seems like if you read it, you'll be like, oh yeah, but that's exactly what I was taught Christianity was. Like, because I think he was that influential. It's a kind of apologetic, but not really. It's just a kind of explanation of, well, this is how you should be. There's kind of no nonsense about it, and take it seriously, make it central to your life, kind of thing. Yeah.
I guess the irony now is the evangelicals dislike it because it stands on atonement, and the progressives kind of reject the premise of it in the first place anyway. So.
And C.S. Lewis isn't cool for progressives. Like I mean, he wrote Narnia. He was quite literal. He definitely, believed in the saved and unsaved kind of paradigm. So tell people a little bit about the atonement thing.
The atonement thing, I guess John Piper and his clan, for want of a better word, have come out over the past decade or so and said, oh, well, there's some things about C.S. Lewis to be celebrated, but ultimately he doesn't accept kind of penal substitution, and has generally shown a bit of a disregard for atonement theory, which for I guess a little while for conservative evangelicals has been the kind of the shibboleth. Do you know what I mean? Like the in or out question is your stance on atonement theory.
And the popular one that I keep on hearing about was actually a few years ago. Every progressive was like, "Yeah, I'm more about Christus Victor," as the kind of like Christ having a victory over death and hell and all that kind of stuff, rather than I paid the price for in your place. I mean, they both have biblical underpinnings and support, right? So can't be that stupid to believe in either.
Either or more besides, I suppose. And didn't realise we were getting into atonement theory on this podcast, but there we go. I would encourage everyone, if you're not read up, get a little summary sheet of different atonement theories and have a read and see what you think and where you land on that, because there's some. For me, they all provide a different window to look at the cross through, and the more windows, I guess, the more depth of understanding. And even if you don't kind of come down and say, oh, it's definitely this or definitely this, as many people would encourage you to do so, I think have a little read of atonement theory, because that's some cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are listening to this, you're listening to Bare Christianity, by the way, and if you have any, what's your favorite atonement theory? I feel like this is not a serious theological podcast. We sometimes tag it with theology, and I think that is a flat-out lie.
Like 1/3 of the group has no idea. I have no idea.
But this is
But that's
fine.
okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. I dumb it down for the rest of you out there.
No, don't do this. You're also representing an entire gender. Don't dumb it down.
I'm not dumbing it down because of my gender. I'm dumbing it down because I'm dumb.
This is not true.
I'm the outlier. I am the exception to the rule.
Are you?
All other females are much smaller than me.
This is weird, and I don't like
stance that I've taken.
I don't like the vibe that we're going with here. I don't like where we're going with this, and I don't want to get cancelled because we don't have enough listeners. It ain't right. Okay, so we actually had people get in touch with us, including Robert Herning, who in our last episode, if you didn't listen to it, you really need to, because you'll remember that we bought a beer, and by we I definitely mean Drabs, bought a beer for the guy who asked all the questions that formed the basis of the last episode, or most of the questions that formed the basis of the last episode. Robert Herning got in touch and said, thank you so much for the money. I was a little bit confused why a total stranger just sent me some money by PayPal, but apparently then when he was listening to the episode, he laughed a lot, which makes me really happy.
I mean, the real question is, did he buy a beer with it?
I don't know, Robert. You have to get in touch.
Yeah, Robert, let us know.
Which beer?
Which beer?
Yeah, which beer did you buy?
And was it off the list that you sent us?
Yeah.
We have so many questions for you, Robert. You need to start a podcast answering our questions.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you, Robert, for getting back in touch with us. If you want to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us at BeerXianity, that's X in a place of a Christ, on Twitter. You can email us at beerchristianity@yahoo.com. You can find the podcast at beerchristianity.libsyn.com, and we're on Instagram, we're everywhere basically, and you can get in touch. We had another message from a listener asking some questions, so we thought we would read that out now.
Okay, so hey Jonty, following your delight at receiving an email for Beer Christianity, I thought I'd ping a message without the shelp of taking note of the
Schlep.
Okay.
Schlep. Do you not even speak Yiddish? Oh my goodness.
Laura's going to read the rest of this message.
Oh dear. Shall we do a paragraph each?
Okay, yeah, you finish that paragraph. This
It's
seems...
a bit like a home group, isn't it? Do a verse each.
And then we're each going to discuss what it meant to us.
I'm enjoying the podcast and your reflection of various topics, particularly with the Scottish lady. Her name escapes me, but it's Amy, Scottish Amy. And with the man from Zim, was it?
Yes, that's right.
From Zim.
Pick it from Zim.
Talking about poaching, etc.
Okay, I grew up in the area and went to high school in Didcot, so your comments on the area drink establishment bring me much amusement. I think I would have been far less positive. Everyone's down on Didcot drinking establishment.
Having lived in South Oxford, Bristol, Cape Town, and now Paris, dude gets around. I have seen church and mission /church, and then I'm currently at a space of thinking through Missio Dei instituted church. Oh, I'm not reading that well. I'm currently at a space of thinking through Missio Dei instituted church, so I'm struggling to separate the two in thought processes. This is very done in many different ways, sometimes perhaps too culturally appropriate and others nowhere near enough.
I'd be fascinated to hear conversations on church mission, how they fit or translate into cultural context, whilst maintaining the idea of holiness, set apart people of God, seen in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Or perhaps a better question is, what does holiness look like as individuals and faith communities when living and speaking out a holistic gospel?
He then apologizes for that not being concise, but I think that's pretty concise. And he also said that we need to get the app Untapped, because it's a beer rating and tracking app.
Amazing.
And we could definitely get on that so we could toast and like our drinks and stuff like that, which I think is an excellent idea. And we are actually going to do that. We'll probably do that after this episode, or by the time we're on this episode. I think it'll be very cool. So that was Matt. Thank you so much, Matt from Paris.
It was Matt who recommended that we come to a couple of Tolkien and Lewis pubs in Oxford. And here we are.
Yeah, because the other one is the Lamb and Flag, I think, across the road. I don't know any of the others, actually. So, Matt, if you know more of them, you need to let us know. Yeah. That'd be awesome.
Also, while we're just back on the subject of Lewis and Tolkien, I feel like we should have a toast to Christopher Tolkien, who at the time of this recording died, I think, like 4 days ago. So Christopher Tolkien is the youngest son of JRR Tolkien and, like, edited and...
What's the inklings, eh?
I don't... Yeah. Yes. Jobs is not big. Yes. Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Sure. Why not? But yeah, he posthumously published tons of Tolkien's work, and if you're a Tolkien fan, you will be familiar with him, and I'm sure will be sad at his passing. So yeah, we should toast to
Cheers
to
Christopher.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we should probably get another beer and then, get back with that. It is my round. So, I'm going to pause this recording and then we can carry on. And just do a little bit of sound check. Okay, so what has happened? Whoa, it's just opening up here on the screen.
Who pressed that?
Oh, I don't know. I just freaked out. I freaked out!
I used to work in radio.
Used to be a DJ.
Yeah. You guys can go to hell.
When I was on the radio.
Go to hell like Susan.
You guys can go to hell like Susan for being bitches. We wanted to tell you about the beers. So we were drinking a Wainwright's Golden something or other.
And this is a St. Austell. I don't know.
No, man, the St. Austell one is the one that's this
Oh,
pub's beer.
snap. Oh, okay, so I'm drinking the Wainwright.
You're drinking the Wainwright.
They're both pretty indistinguishable, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm drinking a St. Austell, but it is, a pub. This is a pub owned by this is a Wainwright.
This is owned by St. Austell, yeah, which is a brewery which does produce a half-decent beer called Tribute. They're based down in Cornwall. They don't serve Tribute here. No, they just serve the lesser.
They serve Doombar. I like Doombar.
Yeah, I like a Doombar. We're getting a Doombar next.
And Cormorant Strike likes a Doombar.
Cormorant Strike is not a real person.
That is true. We also have spoken to some of the people who are here. One group of lads who you can hear in the background, we were absolutely convinced they were Christians, but 2 out of the 3 are, so I don't think that's terrible. Well, I was convinced. Drabs wasn't.
I was less so, yeah. I was looking at the one who wasn't, to be fair.
Was it the cool one? Yeah. And I met somebody at the bar who was buying some C.S. Lewis memorabilia or Tolkien memorabilia, and so I got chatting with him, and this is what he said.
Strings.
So I've just met somebody at the bar who is here specifically because he loves Tolkien a lot. Hey man, what's your name?
Matt.
Matt, what do you love about Tolkien so much?
First, I wouldn't have read Lord of the Rings if it was not for Peter Jackson movies.
Fair.
Yeah. Then I started to read it, and I could say it's quite difficult to do it.
Yeah.
It's described too much story in it, and I'd say if you have not seen the movie, it's difficult to understand the book.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, I can. Well, for me, I've never actually managed it. So yeah. But you're here in the Eagle and Child because of Tolkien, or do you like C.S. Lewis as well, or?
No, most specifically for the Inklings.
The Inklings generally.
Yeah. I did buy the Chronicle of Narnia, 7 books, so I need to start to read them.
Excellent.
One day.
Oh, fantastic. And what do you like about the Inklings?
Actually, I know shit about it. I thought we were a group of literate professors here in Oxford, and I'm a big fan of it. I did read on Google that they used to come to this table over here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, number 6 and 7. So I said, let's go there.
They used to sit there, and like the bar lady was telling us that they actually used to they read the first chapter of Lord of the Rings at this table.
Well, there were not just Tolkien and Lewis, there were other authors with as well Christopher Tolkien, who died 2 days ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very sad.
Yeah.
Ah, well, cool. Well, nice to meet you, and hope you enjoy your time at the Eagle and Child.
Well, actually, I'm going now. So.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, bye. Okay, that's what he said. So I'm going to drop that in.
I don't think we went into what I'm drinking, which I think is a bit rude.
Oh my goodness! This is the patriarchy.
Yeah, I'm drinking a Jack and Coke. Oh, psych! I'm not. It's in.
Wow! Mind blown!
In a break from tradition, Laura's gone for a Mortimer's Orchard cider, which is a very good cider, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
Cheers! Woo! All right. Wait, can we put you on the podcast just briefly? You need to tell us. Okay, so we met somebody. He was sitting next to us. Josh, hey, say hi, Josh.
Hello, how are you?
So Josh is drinking
a wide audience.
No, not really.
Fair enough. That's why you got me on it.
Josh, are you a theology student?
I am, yeah.
Excellent. Where are you studying?
Well, I'm studying at Harris Manchester College. I'm in my final year undergrad.
Excellent. And are you going to become a minister, a theologian?
I am absolutely not.
100%.
I considered the theologian path.
Excellent.
But
nice.
after a few years of Oxford, you need to get out.
So what's the plan?
Law is the plan, actually.
Oh, wow. Theology, then law.
Well, a good Protestant tradition there, isn't there? Yes. We're all lawyers.
Absolutely. We got into a brief chat with you about John Piper because we slag him off a little bit on this podcast, and you said that we had to listen to a particular talk which was the basis of a particular book. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's his talk in, I think it was 2001 or 2002, called Don't Waste Your Life. I think it was at one of the early Passion conferences, where he has this phenomenal analogy about seashells, and how there was about a couple in Florida that he'd read about who
they sell them on the seashore.
That was almost funny. It's a
savage burn.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, if I get invited. It was a story he'd read about a couple who'd retired early and moved to Florida and then collected seashells in their spare time. And his big punchline about it was, well, on the day of judgment they will say, "Look, Lord, my shell collection." And he was telling people not to waste their life. Other than that, he's a bit, iffy. But it was a very nice analogy there. Yeah. Good knowledge of Greek.
What should people be doing instead of collecting seashells?
Well, according to him, they should be driving off cliffs in Africa. I think that is what he said. I don't know. What should they be doing? I think they should be reading more and praying more, probably. I should certainly be doing that. Yeah, and loving my neighbour slightly more and drinking slightly less, seeing as you're in a pub.
Damn it! Yes. We just got asked a really interesting question about what does personal holiness look like. It was one of the listeners asking, what does personal holiness look like if you're trying to live out a holistic gospel?
Oh gosh, you're throwing me in the deep end here, aren't you? I am a theologian. I have a slightly non-theological answer because you ask, and the first thing I think of are people that I've met who've had this deep level of personal holiness, I suppose it's this consistent prayer life that kind of radiates from the face almost when you meet people, and they have this inner peace about them. I think it's when you can meet someone and they put you at ease and you kind of know that they walk with God. That's when you feel inner holiness. I don't know how to get to it, evidently. But
pretty holy to me.
No, that's the beer.
Excellent. Josh, thank you so much. What are you guys drinking tonight?
I am drinking Breakspear. Ollie is drinking Nicholson. And I think Jordan is on red wine.
Excellent.
It's a bit of a mix.
Which one's the heathen?
Well, we're Anglicans.
Awesome. Oh, nice to meet you.
Very good to meet you.
Okay, well, good answers there. And, it does make the rest of the content of this podcast just a little bit flimsy because we are not smart like Josh. That's the main thing that we need to remember here.
So a warning to anyone who's ever in a pub that we're recording in, because we will grab you and we will use you for content.
Absolutely we will. Okay, so that's a really good starting point for the question about personal holiness when you're living out a holistic gospel. I think that's a kind of classic answer about personal holiness, about kind of prayer and reflection and a kind of me and Jesus life. Yeah, that feels like a kind of fairly traditional space, although including the love of neighbor, which is quite holistic. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so I think one of the problems with the traditional conservative, I don't know about conservative progressive divide or whatever else, but is that one side traditionally emphasizes personal holiness in terms of prayer and relationship with God and not committing personal sins, whether they're sexual sins or alcohol or whatever the hell else, right?
But they're usually sexual sins.
Yeah, everyone is normally like, okay, and the other side just goes all out social justice and says, screw it, we don't care about the other stuff, we don't need to pray, and we can have loads of sex and we can help the poor, and that's what's gonna work. And
sometimes that's what's gonna help. A hand job, not
Ask
a hand
Oxfam.
out. No, whoa, that was two solid jokes at once. Unbelievable. Also, that was dirtier than we usually go. Sorry for our good, pure, personally holy audience.
Okay.
Sorry. Not my joke, actually. Somebody else's, but still. Alex, if you're listening, that was your joke. But yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. The trouble is sometimes we look at them in terms of what's the emphasis. Like, do we chase one or not the other, rather than the thinking of, well, let's just chase both to the max. I don't know, like one they're not mutually exclusive. One doesn't come at the expense of other.
Absolutely, you don't have to choose. I mean, for you, like, how important is the kind of personal morality, how much time I'm spending talking to God, and and that sort of stuff as you measure how well you're doing as a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, it is very important. I'm not saying that I'm measuring well, normally. Surely I'm definitely not measuring as well as I should be. But yeah, I think that's definitely important. It's kind of like what I was talking about in the New Year's resolutions episode about like the reflexive faith of being like, of the talking to God being a reflex in any situation. And like, yeah, I think that's like a massive part of kind of personal holiness and how you kind of, how you live yourself, but also how you interact with other people around you and the situations that you have around you. Like, yeah, like reflectively praying is like, yeah, like a really important part.
So for me, like, I grew up in a fairly fundamentalist church. I say grew up, I became a Christian after going to a fairly fundamentalist church for quite a while, and I remember the focus being on personal morality and personal kind of spirituality, and that being the thing. So like eliminating sin and praying more, reading your Bible more, reading your Bible being seen as a good act in itself. I don't think I believe that anymore. I think it's useful to you, but I don't think it's good in itself. I think if you have to choose between helping somebody or going, I'm sorry, I've got to read my Bible, I don't know. I think you need to help somebody, and I mean, maybe it's do one and not neglect the other, or...
Look, I think if the expression of your faith in your lifestyle means that you don't swear and you don't have sex outside of marriage and you read your Bible lots and you pray, that is good news for no one. Like, it's good news for no one but you. And ultimately, if your faith isn't having a positive impact on the people around you and the people who aren't around you but who are the other side of the world, then it's not one that reflects the gospel.
But is God pleased by that anyway? Might he be pleased, like by a hermit monk living a holy life dedicated to him? Do you think possibly?
I think yes, but like I feel like with the hermit monk situation, you're more removed from like the daily things of like daily horrendousness of everyday life, and like kind of what Jabs was saying, like if you're passing by somebody on the street who is clearly in pain and saying, "Oh, I'll pray for you," rather than being like, "Hey, can I do something to help you right now?" Like, I think that's.
Well, that's Book of James stuff, really. That's really. The other thing that personal holiness makes me think about. It used to be about how much am I reading my Bible, how much am I praying, a quantitative kind of thing. It became a qualitative, well, am I just righteous? Am I holy? Am I the kind of person who I picture holy people being? And I think I've got more to a measure in place again of how much of an asshole am I still? In that old kind of testimony kind of way of like, I used to be like this, and then Jesus came into my life, and now I'm like this. And it's really cool if you can like kick an addiction. Or my thing was I was afraid of going to hell, if I'm honest. And I've only recently come to a thing of trying to, or being made aware of just how much is wrong with me. I think by going to counselling actually, and going like, when somebody says, "Oh, you're pretty high functioning," I'm like, "Oh, awkward." Like realizing that you might be a very bad person who you're being saved by God and having the Holy Spirit transforming you may be really good news for the people around you in a way that you would be so much worse. That your personality would be having. I've been watching the Jonestown documentary on Netflix. I'm not gonna lie. No, on the iPlayer, and that kind of stuff. Like just thinking like the kind of negative impact you could be having on people's lives versus the minimized negative impact you're having now. I don't know. Does that count as holiness? It's not really set apartness, but
I think it does, because I've been kind of dealing with have kind of been thinking about the fact of like. Your body is a temple and your mind is part of that, and like you being kinder to yourself is a godly thing. The self-hating thoughts a lot of us feel are sinful, because that's not okay. And I think it's okay to want to be better in yourself and to like yourself more and to pray for that. And I don't see anything inherently sinful in wanting to be better in yourself, to better yourself and also to be a better person to the people around you. Like I don't ever see any problem in that.
When Matt asked the question, he said about the Old Testament. What does it mean to be set apart in the Old Testament? And ultimately that hangs on the Ten Commandments. And I might be wrong, but I think it was pretty 50-50 in terms of personal holiness and kind of social justice, in terms of 5...
And racial purity, it also has to be said, which is awkward.
But yeah, the kind of the idea that both are very much present and equally weighted in that.
Yeah, and you've always got that thing of like non-Christians going like, well, yeah, if we all just lived by the Ten Commandments, I'm like, do you remember the first one? Which is very much about worship nobody but the Lord. That's the deal. So you can just kind of ignore that entirely and go, well, I'm doing some good stuff, and you end up not going to church, because going to church isn't a measure of holiness particularly, or not of goodness anyway. And you can end up eliminating most of the Christian from your life. What do you do to make sure that you don't fall into a completely non-Christian existence? And I always ask myself this question at the moments before I became more kind of focused on my own faith, was what would I look like? What would be different if I wasn't a Christian in my life right now? Like, is there anything that would be different? And if there isn't, I think that may be a problem. Okay, they both look pretty bleak right now. I just like...
One of the problems with the if you like, measures of personal holiness that are advocated by the churches that probably we and most our listeners go to, is I think they're a little bit limited, and maybe they're a little bit one-dimensional. They do tend to orientate. Ultimately, they boil down to reading the Bible and praying and not committing sexual sin. Is probably the three main ones, isn't it? Purity, yeah. And I think if we can expand beyond that a little bit, one of the concepts I've found helpful is there's a book by someone. It's not very good. It's called, the concept and the idea of it is very good. It's called Sacred Pathways. Do you know these stupid personality tests you take? You know, like Bell-Bin or MTBI or whatever else.
Ooh, somebody asked if we could do something on the Enneagram. I know very little about the
Enneagram, all the rest of it, yeah. It's kind of like one of that for how do you best relate to God. And it's 7 different, it's called Sacred Pathways, 7 different kind of personality types relating to God. That as a concept was super helpful for me, and realizing like, oh, okay, these are, the church might advocate 1 or 2 of those, but actually there's a whole realm of different that is just not catered for, and exploring that. So I think I want to say Gary Roberts off the top of my head, and maybe way off, but a book called Sacred Pathways. Don't read the whole thing, just read the kind of the introduction and the outro and the one that applies to you, and that'll be fine.
Excellent. There's that thing that those churches say, which is salt mustn't lose its saltiness. We are meant to be a people set apart. We are meant to stand out and be different. We're not meant to just look like everybody else. We're not meant to just be like everybody else. And you hear this talk about like Halloween and anything that is aesthetically not pleasing to kind of, mainstream churches or to conservative Christians. And we need to stand out against that because it's awful, and because standing out is in itself a good thing. And I actually have some sympathy for that, because how do you draw people to Christ if there is nothing different about you? If there is no difference in your life, if there is no... And we don't all get to have the personal testimony of like, hey, I was fucking killing everybody and then I stopped, Like most of us are actually quite ordinary, boring people. And I think for me, the picture of like a Christian being different is really exciting when you start thinking about what we do in the world in terms of social justice. Like, I never felt like my witness was better than when I was once a week doing homeless work, where we were handing out food, where we were just hanging out with dudes, and it wasn't a kind of like weird savior complex thing. It was just a hanging out and talking to the guys and treating them like human beings, because most of the rest of the time they didn't get that from people. And that was in itself, like, I felt every time like I was meeting Jesus. And the idea that our witness, that we could be really distinct, but not because we don't have sex, or if you don't want to have sex, fine, then don't have sex. But if, I think people care a lot more, they're not going to go like, oh wow, I want to be like that, I want to be an incel,
that is what I need in my life.
Or a volcel, or whatever it is, like, But if they were like, oh, these are the guys who legitimately love their enemies. These are the guys who legitimately are not seeking to overpower the people around them. They are driven by forgiveness. They are driven by not hating their enemies. They are driven by giving good things to people who don't deserve it, because they recognize that they don't deserve it. They're not about winning. They're about kindness and about love and about the goodness that Jesus brings in a really kind of unique way. That for me is the kind of, could we stand out? Could we be known as those guys of like, we'd love to go to war, but the fucking Christians won't let us? Or like, we can't kick that homeless guy in the head after our night out because we've got a Christian with us and he will freak out and he will defend him to the death, kind of thing. Like if we were known as that in terms of personal holiness, and hell, if we were also like, you know what, I don't treat people like pieces of meat either, I have a respect for myself because I believe God respects me. Like, could that be a version of personal holiness that we could chase after as Christians?
I just wondering whether you think our identity as exiles and whether that fits in with that, because like we are supposed to be the ones who are different. We are supposed to be the outliers in the situation, but I don't know that to everyone we're supposed to be this is the ideal we should be living to, because that kind of defeats the point of being an exile. Like obviously it would be amazing if everyone was like, oh yeah, these Christians are doing things right, we should absolutely do things the way they're doing it. But I don't know that that's our purpose, is for everyone to see that we're doing it and then do things just because they're seeing us doing it. I think our whole purpose is to do it anyway, regardless of what everyone else is seeing.
Amen. I think that's genuinely true. And the idea of being exiles, like Walter Brueggemann's, is it Brueggemann? I feel like it is Brueggemann who talks about us as being very different from the mode of empire. Okay. you really said like a man who had more to say about that. But like actually, standing out from, if we are in a consumerist society, and it's not just standing out because it's for the sake of standing out, but if we're in a consumerist society, the Christians should be the ones who are not super impressed by consumption, who are not super impressed. We're not the guy. I mean, I know I've ranted about label clothing, but that kind of thing. It's like that. It's like we're not buying into that kind of mentality, capitalism, imperialism, all that sort of stuff. We're stepping out of those values because we serve a higher king, and that may be actually it. It's the exile, Laura. I think that's a brilliant analogy. Like we are not serving this kingdom.
I think this is the first time on the podcast ever that I've made this much of a point. Like this, let's all bask in that.
Don't get above yourself here, Laura. It's not that great a point. No,
I made a theological point, everyone.
It's also not true. Oh, come now.
Can we touch briefly on the question that Matt raised, which was about the cultural expressions of church, and he talks about having lived in South Africa, Bristol, and Cape Town and Paris, seen church and mission church done in many different ways, sometimes culturally appropriate and others nowhere near enough. How do we fit into cultural context whilst maintaining the idea of being set apart?
Yeah. So, what's your thoughts?
My thoughts is that. Okay, very briefly going to get a little bit technical, which if you haven't come across the C1 to 6 spectrum, which is a kind of spectrum of cultural appropriateness. So C1 is...
So this is usually used to describe Muslim background believers in Jesus.
Oh, maybe I do know what this is.
You do know what this is.
You've explained this to me. Sorry, carry on.
So C1 is that the Muslim background believers have to sing 10,000 Reasons, and that is
in English, and they are wearing Western clothing, and it has a fully Western expression.
And it is guitars and drums and all that.
And if you want to come to faith in Jesus, you have said to everybody, "I am now a Christian. I reject Islam and all of the culture that comes with it."
C5 is at the other end of the spectrum, and that's more like essentially you remain within the mosque and worship Christ within the mosque. And C6 is more persecuted church stuff, so that's slightly different. But
that's not my understanding. So I thought C5. So if you got that, then C2 is like you can sing 10,000 Reasons, but you can change the language to your heart language. And then C3 is like, you know what? If you want to bring in a bell, from your culture, that's cool. Or like sit on the floor, or any of that stuff. What's that stuff you have in white churches? They're like, let's pray like they do in Africa. We're going to pray at the same time. And like, that's how they pray in fucking Pentecostal churches, friends. It's not Africa specific. Anyway, so but now let's and then 5 is you're actually praying. You're washing ritually before you touch the Bible. Okay. You're praying, but prostrated towards Jerusalem. You are doing things in obviously your own language and your own cultural stance. You are finding Jesus potentially in the Quran as well as the Bible. You're doing all that kind of stuff. And then C6 is you consider yourself a Muslim. You're just a Muslim who has a personal relationship with Jesus. And that's, I think, where the challenging thing comes in, because that can be quite difficult for people in our context, because our natural thing is like, well, crap, I mean, that seems pretty intense, that seems syncretism, as if Christianity, which has grown up in the West over the last few centuries, has not brought in our own culture, has not brought in our own way of thinking about that. So like understanding that C1 to C6 kind of spectrum, what do you think that teaches us about where we are?
I think one of the mistakes with that spectrum is that we focus too much on we basically think about being set apart too much in terms of like how your expression of worship differs, and we get too caught up with things like basically whether or not we like to sing Matt Redman, instead of the things that we've been talking about in terms of like, okay, but are you different in terms of behaviors? Are you different in terms of values and all the rest of it? And frankly, if you're a Muslim background believer and you want to sing Matt Redman, I mean, God bless your soul.
Bless the Lord, oh your soul.
Your soul.
Or frankly, if you want to continue to remain in the community that built around your mosque and find a means for worshipping Christ in there, that is less important than reflecting Christ in your lifestyle and in the values and the behaviors that you express through that. And I think sometimes, particularly in the mission community, we can, which the kind of three of us come from a little bit, is we can get a little bit too excited and caught up and sidetracked by how much we do and don't reflect culture. And hell, like as a Protestant, do you know what I mean? Like sometimes I like to sing Matt Redman, other times I prefer to sing in Latin, and sometimes I like singing in tongues. Like what the hell? Do you know, I can do what the hell I want because of glorious Protestant, and none of that has any bearing on how much I'm set apart. Yeah. Because I may be set apart from culture from singing in Latin, but that means nothing to anyone, least of all Christ. Like, do you know what I mean? What actually matters is behaviours and values and worship and all the rest of it. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And like, I think something you've always brought up to me about like with my writing and stuff is that we don't necessarily appreciate the massive lifestyle difference it is for somebody in a Muslim community to accept Christ into their lives. Like, that's not just accepting Christ and finding new life in Christ. That is losing your entire existing life. And like it's understandable that you wouldn't want to lose your entire connection of people immediately. Like it's very privileged, and I think almost inappropriate of us to be able to be like, well, like, you know, but you know, you've got Christ, that's all you need. Like, no, you're accepting Christ, but you're also losing your entire family. Like, that is heavy, and like, like, if people want to express that differently to how we express it, like, why shouldn't they? Like,
and particularly because there's nothing particularly Christian about our culture.
Yeah.
There's nothing particularly Christian about some theology that is based mostly on some Scottish and German motherfuckers, like a few hundred years ago.
Like the Baptist Church, like immediately, as soon as the Baptist Church disagrees on something, it's like, well, we better be a different kind of church. Like, you know? Okay,
I kind of love that though. I really do. I do.
It's like I would read like reflex responses like, fuck you guys, we're gonna do our own thing and you guys are sinful.
Okay, but that's particularly Baptist because we have no pope, and that's what the Baptists really need, is a pope. And I think if this podcast can do one thing, it is to advocate strongly for a pope for the Baptists. I think.
Who would be the Baptist pope?
I'm available. Is what I'm going to say. I'm around. So I go to a Hillsong church, right? And I feel like when people are talking about the contextualized thing, they're always talking about, well, you don't want people to have to leave their own culture and create that sense of anomie where they've lost everything and alienate people in the name of Jesus, because hey, that's not a really good idea. But then when they talk about culture, they get this. There's a paternalistic exoticism that comes with it. When I worked at a record company in South Africa, people we'd say, hey, we got a whole bunch of bands to a European distributor, and they'd go, ooh, yeah, we'd love to hear them. Ooh, like, wow, a South African goth band, that's great. And they listen to the kind of like, well, this just sounds like a goth band. And we're like, yeah, because it's a goth band. And they're like, yeah, but I mean, like, where's the tribal drumming? Where's the, and there are some exceptions like Sepultura, who's really made a good thing out of that, where they haven't compromised the thrash, ethos at all, but they have, included the Brazilian roots and all that kind of stuff. Like, well, I didn't want to listen to African, goth, and maybe I'm a victim of, I visited Congo, and I had the privilege of meeting with worship leaders from a local church there. They were super into Michael W. Smith. That the dude was like, that was his thing. He loved Michael W. Smith. That's what he wanted to be like. And to say, well, I'm afraid not, you have to sound like Afrobeat.
Oh wow, that's a whole nother kind of cultural imposition, isn't it?
It totally is. And to go like, well, I'm sorry, you're from Africa, so you're not allowed to like Matt Redman. And they'd be like, well, I'm a dazzling young urbanite, and I do fucking like Matt Redman, so fuck you. Well, they wouldn't say that because they have more personal holiness than we do, obviously. But when I go to Hillsong, like when people are talking about like, but you need to make it contextual and we need to make our worship contextual, and they always mean like becoming as close to kind of like local folk music as possible. Like if it's like, let's be contextual in India, they're not talking about Indian pop music, which has got a lot in common with Western stuff. And that's what most of the kids are listening to. It's like, no. We want a sitar. And if there's no sitar, it's not real and it's not legit. And they never mean that those same people always hate the big worship band, the multi-chorus, the really high production value stuff. And I go to Hillsong and I'm just like, this is the most contextualized form of Christianity I've ever seen. You're meeting people exactly where they are, and you're making it entirely orientated around somebody totally random walking off the street and being able to engage with this. And they're not hiding the fact that they're worshiping Jesus. Like, they're really not liberal about that stuff, but they're just focusing on that in a way that is really quite accessible, which I really dig, even though, it's not my kind of music either, so I'm always just like, yeah, whatever.
And that doesn't inherently make them more or less a set-apart people of God than the people who are singing in Latin on a Sunday and ringing bells and lighting candles in a way that is not particularly like culturally attuned. But this is the superficial, surface level expressions of worship, kind of cultural adaptation, which I think is quite distinct and far removed almost from what set apart means.
And we were talking about Christus Victor earlier about like, it's not about Jesus dying as a lamb, a sacrifice. I think Steve Cho called it, cosmic child abuse or something, which I thought was a little bit hardcore considering it's a fairly biblical concept, but I get what he meant. So everyone was like, oh no, Christus Victor, that's a much better way of looking at it. But actually, when we start talking about, Christianity is more about having victory over death and victory over hell and all that kind of stuff, sure, but isn't that just being exactly what Western culture is about, which is worshipping strength, which is saying we're never the guys who lose, we're always, like, as long as we can tell this story in a way where we're the winners, then it's a fine story to tell. And we worship, I heard Richard Rohr call him the crucified loser. The guy, like, that is not a pose of I know we like to think of it as victory, and it is victory in a sense, I guess, but it's the dude who lost, and being okay with that. The guy who submitted, who could have fought back but didn't. That's our thing, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, that felt less of a cul-de-sac.
Yes, preach.
I agree.
Preach, and while you preach, I'm going to get another beer.
Okay, excellent. I shouldn't have one because I'm driving.
So responsible.
Oh, I know. Okay, so the other question that we had from listeners was from Melky, who is the designer of our logo, which is a wonderful logo, and you should really check it out. It's got a lot of cool stuff in it. And Melky was asking what we thought about the concept of moderate Muslims versus moderate Christians. The idea that, we need to be promoting and kind of getting behind the moderate Muslims. And I've heard this spoken about a lot, actually by quite progressive, reasonable people working in the Middle East going, yeah, but you need to encourage the moderate guys, otherwise, the crazy guys will go. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
You go first, Rob.
That's pretty racist, I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, you would never expect anyone, you would never expect to be asked, how life is like as a moderate Christian. That's not a thing. No, and the idea that it's because most white people have the underlying expectation that all Muslims are terrorists, and it's it's either you're a terrorist or you're a moderate Muslim, whatever that even means, and it's no, friend, no, don't ask that question.
Also, the idea of a moderate Christian, I just remember my fundamentalist days, and it really does just kind of I get this kind of knee-jerk tick on my face kind of thing. Did you ever listen to a Christian punk band on Tooth and Nail called Value Pack? and they had this thing that was like, it went like really fast, and then the chorus was just like in a really damning tone, Sunday Christian. They're like, yeah, you're a Sunday Christian, you know, like screw you, you know, you're not a real Christian.
Okay, so the thing is with the modern Muslim thing is it's been used both by Muslims and by people who aren't Muslims as a way of defining themselves by not being extremists, right?
Yeah.
And
you can see why people would do that so as not to get freaking, you know, put on a list.
I know, and I get why, you know, is it a shame that the Muslims have to define themselves by what they're not, like extremists? Yeah, absolutely, that's a shame. But also, kind of useful, eh? Do you never get into those conversations where you mention for the first time in a group of people that maybe you're a Christian, and straight away they're thinking like, oh, he must hate gays and, you know, be offended if I swear and not drink and all the rest of it, and like
I've usually said the word motherfucker quite a lot by that point.
Well, exactly. So you either have to go guns blazing like you do and start swearing, or you just have to kind of do that awkward thing. You go, oh, you know, Ellen DeGeneres, isn't she wonderful, or something like you just.
And she's not, because she's a filthy liberal scumbag who's trying to rehabilitate George W. Bush's reputation.
And actually, the freedom to just go, oh no, I'm a moderate would be kind of useful. No, come on.
No.
Okay. Also, next thing is
no. You know why? Because that's exactly the same kind of thing as going like, you know, I'm a Christian, but I'm not that kind of Christian, and like you're just dissing everybody else. You're just going like, I'm a Christian, but I'm cooler than all the rest of them. How does that help? Like, oh, cool, I'm gonna come to your fucking church.
Okay,
you know?
but the next thing is like, of all the. I don't know. I don't know how it is for Islam and how the Quran talks about how the world will perceive you and all the rest of it. But if we look at the Bible, right, and if you've a problem with public perceptions of like Christianity and your Christian faith, and you've got an axe to grind because somehow, oh, these people don't really understand me, they don't understand the nuances of my faith or whatever else, I'm like. I don't think that. Let me get this thought coherently. Look, I just...
Is this the people who are like, I'd really rather not be called a Christian because it's got so much baggage, which I totally understand if you're coming from a Muslim context or you're working in, like, you know, Lebanon or in Afghanistan or whatever, but like here, like Anne Rice did a while back, you know, the vampire novelist, she was a Christian, and she eventually was just like, because she didn't like the way like conservative Christians were being dickbags, she was like, I'd rather not call myself a Christian. I'm like, way to not make things better.
Yeah, like why should we, who are actually doing, I don't know, like, this is like blowing our own horn a bit, but like, you know, I feel like we are slightly more Christian, as you would define it, than
no, sir.
But like, you know, you'd rather us be called Christian than like, you know, Christian terrorists or like, you know, Westboro Baptist Church people.
Yeah,
like why should they get to be called Christians but us, like, not us, you know?
Yeah, although they don't punch the mic
all
while
right,
we're recording.
You know,
And that's,
hey,
like Westboro Baptist never did that.
Hey, I've had 2 and a bit ciders.
God
getting angry.
God hates mic bashers. I think that's the...
Hey, it was a mistake. You know, hey, I was in my school's tech team. Like, I know to not tap the mic.
And I was a DJ and I can't work this machine, so... wait, Travis, you're saying something serious.
Wow, savage.
I guess I think if I'm a Christian and the public perception is that, oh, you might be a bigot or you might be extremist or you might be a Trump voter or whatever else, like if that's the worst that the public are throwing at me, then I'm doing all right. Do you know what I mean? Or if that's the kind of public perception and the brand and the labeling. You know, they crucified Christ and they killed the early disciples.
Yeah.
So they're going to label me a bigot? Like what the hell? And
yeah, I think there's things like, I think you want to challenge people's perceptions. That's my kind of thing generally. So I will say that, you know, I'm a Baptist, I'm a Christian, I'm a born again Christian or whatever, And then let's have a conversation. Let's see if you think I'm as unreasonable as... You're going to find me unreasonable because I'm too left-wing. That's why you're going to find me unreasonable. You're not going to find me unreasonable because of that stuff. Except we're going to eventually get down to some stuff where I'm like, yeah, I do maybe believe that you need to come to faith in Jesus. I think that makes a difference. I don't think it's just a thing. Now, do I know any more about universalism versus, eternal conscious torment versus annihilationism or any of that kind of stuff or what happens afterwards? I don't actually. I'm not as certain as I was. I'm certain that I don't know for sure. I'm also certain that none of them seem that unreasonable, and just because we don't like something doesn't mean that it's not necessarily true. So for me, it's like, I'm not an asshole and I'm not an idiot, and I believe this stuff. And that for me seems like a more valuable message than I'm not an asshole and I'm not an idiot, and also screw that stuff. Like what are we winning people to? Again,
so do you describe yourself as a moderate Christian?
No, because another word for moderate is maybe like not maybe too hot or too cold, but maybe just lukewarm. Yeah. I don't consider myself a moderate anything. But I think that's a personality thing, Like I don't think anybody would believe me if I was. Well, yeah, like I don't think anybody. I have to say, I'm more of like a centrist, Like it's just not a. It's not a. That's personality type. It's fine to be moderate, I guess. I just don't understand why it wouldn't be central to you. Why would you care about it if it? And this is a very C.S. Lewis way of thinking about it, because
bringing it back.
His whole thing is like you have to make a decision about Jesus. He is either insane, or he is a terrible person, or he is God. Because he says he's God, he says he's the only way, and either you are actually God when you say that kind of stuff, or you are completely delusional, or you're a terrible person because you're not, and you're going to let people follow you, die for you, all that kind of stuff. And I think for me, that kind of understanding of Jesus, who says these things about himself, you don't get to go, I thought he was a good teacher, because, okay, he was a good teacher who was a lunatic, or he was a good teacher who was deliberately misleading people. But for me, that's the kind of faith that I probably got saved into, and for me, that's the thing, is if it's true, it matters a lot. It doesn't matter a moderate amount.
Yeah, it's also very difficult faith to practice in moderation when you've got Christ who teaches to sell all you have and give it to the poor and to turn the other cheek, and the teachings were just so radical that how would you even start to do that stuff in moderation?
Yeah, absolutely. Like moderately loving your enemies. It's well, I mean, I guess Christian society is doing that quite well right now. Like we love them in the sense that we say it and we also bomb them. I think that's the important thing. So yeah. Well, the Eagle and Child in Oxford is about to close. They've asked us very nicely if we would leave. I don't think it's about the podcast, but it might be. I don't know. And we just wanted to say thank you very much for listening. You can find other Beer Christianity episodes on beerchristianity.libsyn.com, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher, on YouTube. Wow, Laura. On YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram and on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is beerxianity, and you can email us at beerchristianity@yahoo.com. These are all the ways you can find us. Please leave us a review. Please rate us. Please share our content if you enjoy it, and please get in touch and ask us any questions.
We were going to ask one more thing. If you know somebody who knows about C.S. Lewis, then get in touch and we will.
Yeah, and we could interview them. That'd be cool. And if you know people who you think would be cool to come on the show, or if you think you'd be cool to come on the show, then get in touch, because that'd be rad.
Let us know.
And also, we potentially got an interview with Matt Redman lined up, and
yes.
In advance of that, we want to get 10,000 questions from Matt Redman.
That is true. You need to send us a question for Matt Redman. I think that's really important.
That is very important and quintessential to the listening of this podcast.
If every one of our listeners sent us 1,000 questions, we would have 10,000 questions.
Hey, we have loads more than 10 listeners. I think we broke the 1,000 downloads mark ages ago.
Okay, 10 questions, people. That's
10 questions. There we go. 10 questions.
Wow.
So, so we need your questions for Matt Redman. We also have some shows coming up. One will be a... Josh just perked up, was like, I've got some questions.
10,000 reasons why.
There we go. Hey! So send us your questions for Matt Redman. We'll also be hopefully getting some permission from Martin Akkad, who is a Lebanese Christian theologian and scholar.
Former rock star.
Former rock star. He was in a thrash metal band. And we may be getting an interview with him. We'll definitely be getting a talk from him, I think, at some time soon. Assuming he gives us permission. He may have listened to the podcast already and thought, no.
He won't have.
And, that statute of limitations on the Archbishop of Canterbury's interview is also going to be done. So, Justin Welby, we coming for you. And by that, I mean we're going to be publishing that interview I did last year. So, yeah, that's all coming up. Do keep listening, do keep sharing, and thanks. Also, we haven't prayed for this pub, so Laura, it's your turn to pray for the pub.
No.
Do it.
She's
Pray
so
for the people and the people in it, and the people working here, and the pub itself. Let's go.
Okay, I pray for this pub. I pray that it gives good service to everyone that comes into it. I pray for everyone who's in this pub at the moment, especially Josh, because we love him, and to the guy who gave us the Tolkien interview, because he's a real G. And yeah, bless this pub, bless the people who are working in it, because they are legends. And yeah, amen.
Amen. Thanks for listening, guys. See you later.